Hello again, everybody. It's so very lovely to see your virtual faces. I was really sad not to be able to be there on HMS Belfast because of the striking trains, although, of course, solidarity to the unions. But I was still really sad. So it's very nice to be able to gather with you all virtually, at least. I'm talking to you from our new house, which is a bit of a building site. So I'm just going to show you the bit that's done, which is the yellow shutter.
That's it.
And today we're going to be talking about traveling with James Bond. So I can imagine myself away from the building site, although the house is very beautiful, I should say. And I'm going to hand over to David to fill you all in on a bit more of what we're going to be talking about today.
It's funny you say that, Kim, about James Bond being a kind of escape from the chaos of everyday life. I think it's an escape from the weather today. I mean, sorry to be so British about this and start talking about the weather right at the top of the show, but yeah, I'm so glad that so many people have joined us tonight, and I can't help but think that that's partly because we've got a weather situation going on in the UK, very similar to kind of like the way some of the James Bond novels start. So I always think of Dr. No when you've got that really sunny opening, admittedly not very pleasant, but when there's an assassination, but then it cuts to London and it's all drizzly and horrible, and you get that in some of the films as well. So we're going to be talking about travel in James Bond, and travel is integral to James Bond, I think. I don't think anyone on this is going to dispute that. We are going to be focusing on the films as well as the books, but primarily the books. But if you're, I know there are some people in this audience who are massive Fleming fans, and there are some people who've never read any of the Ian Fleming books, and that's absolutely fine. We're not expecting any prior knowledge, and that was the same when we did our last event as well. We will be reading, both of us have chosen an extended extract to read from one of the Fleming books that means a lot to us, but we'll always contextualize everything that we're talking about. So this is not really going to be like Wish You Were Here. Those of people in the audience old enough to remember people like Judith Chalmers going away on expensive holidays at ITV's expense. That's more of a joke for the British audience here, but it's not really a holiday program. It's kind of like, it's not just Kim and I listing all the lovely places that we've been from Bond stories. I'm sure we will end up slipping into that, especially in the Q&A section. But we're going to be focusing on really kind of four areas, and the first of those areas is how much travel is responsible for the success of Bond in the books and films and other media as well. Also, how to travel like Bond and how not to travel like James Bond. And we're not saying James Bond gets everything right. There are some very dubious decisions, especially around what Bond packs in his suitcase. Why do we have the urge to travel to places from books and films? It's a really interesting question, and we're going to share our thoughts on that one. And in the Q&A section, we'd love to hear from you as well. And how do real life travel experiences that we've had or want to have, because there's lots of places from Bond stories that we've not had the chance to go to, but how do we think that they might compare with Bond's and Fleming's? We'll just say at the top of this, we are going to be focusing mostly on the 14 Bond books published by Fleming, but we will also be referring to Thrilling Cities. And I'm flagging that up now because a lot of people have never read Thrilling Cities. I imagine some people won't even know Thrilling Cities exists, but in his job on the Times, Fleming did well, he got paid to travel the world and write articles about it. So he kind of was doing a Judith Chalmers at the time. So he went round Thrilling Cities, yeah, so 13, well, actually technically 14, because he does go to Las Vegas and Los Angeles in the same chapter. So we will be referencing his travel writing as well as we go through. So let's start. Let's kind of have a thinking about why is travel so integral to the success of Bond?
I think it's two things primarily. Partly it's when these books came out. It's really interesting looking at them from our perspective now, when travel is, relatively much easier and more affordable, and EasyJet and things like that kind of mean we can go almost anywhere. But think back to the 1950s and 60s when Fleming's books first came out. You've got post-war rationing. And for readers, I think it was this window into a world that they couldn't really access. So there was something very kind of exotic, for lack of a better word, for a lot of the readers. So I think partly it's that, and then partly it's the idea of a kind of quest narrative, and travel being so essential to that, which we'll come back to a bit later. But I think really without the travel element, Bond just wouldn't be Bond.
I think you're right. And I mean, if you think about Moonraker is the only story, I'm right in saying that, and Moonraker is the only one of the Bond stories written by Fleming that's set entirely. Oh no, you've got Property of a Lady as well, set in Sotheby's auction. Yeah, the short story. So most of the Bond novels do go to places which were impossibly exotic. I know there are some, Kim and I talked about this a while back. There are some kind of sensitivities around the word exotic nowadays, but we are going to use that word, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that later on. Yeah, because inevitably Fleming was writing about cultures that he wasn't a part of himself, and it was always a kind of outsider's point of view, but he really reveled in those opportunities that he had. And there's so many parts of the novels, aren't there, that really make a meal out of travel. Which ones are your favorites?
Well, you can almost just look at the contents page and you can see, you know, there'll be chapter titles like Reception Committee or In Transit. You know, he's structuring it around the act of traveling, and nearly every book will have a scene where Bond packs his suitcase, waits at the airport, description of a flight, and then arriving somewhere. And for me growing up, I don't know about you folks listening, and maybe you can tell us a bit later, but for me growing up, we didn't go on a lot of kind of foreign holidays. So those descriptions of flights I found like really thrilling, you know, even reading them in the 90s. And there are a few particular kind of favorites for me. Probably some of this will resonate with you. I really love in Goldfinger, especially when he's waiting at the airport and he's very soul wearied. And it's very different from the film. You know, the film starts with him you know, killing somebody in the bath and making his quip. But in the start of Goldfinger, the novel, when he's waiting in the airport for the plane, he's getting drunk, he's thinking about death, and he's really kind of, I would say, depressed, which isn't something we'd associate with screen Bond. But his moments of travel are often quite reflective moments because he's just by himself and he's not sort of in action. And I really love those moments.
I think particularly the earlier books revel in those protracted scenes, as you say, of packing, waiting at airports, and I think that's reflecting the early films as well. So you often have shots really excitingly scored more often than not. So John Barry gets out the kind of, I suppose we might say, again, a few sensitivities around this language, but ethnic instrumentation to kind of represent Russia or whichever country he's flying off to. I always think of that scene in not one of the early films, but still relatively early, but Moonraker, when he flies to Rio and you see the Concorde and it's just impossibly glamorous, and you have the Brazilian sounding music on the soundtrack, and Live and Let Die as well, where it's intercut with the playing cards. You have those really exciting, and flying seemed really exciting. And like you, I didn't fly. I think I flew twice as a child, maybe 3 times. So flying always did seem quite exotic to me. And I think the recent films have kind of not done that as much, I think. So I'm thinking of I mean, there are some great scenes, like when he orders the martini in Die Another Day, and he plays London Calling on the soundtrack. So there are those travel scenes, but sometimes you don't even see the plane, do you?
That's right. And when you think about so I don't know if anybody recently has gone and rewatched the Indiana Jones films because of the new one coming out. I'm a big Indiana Jones fan, and I love, you know, when it shows the map when he's on the plane and you get the red dot going across. And I think a lot of that is very Bond inflected because of how Bond really glamorizes the act of travel. And we have Phil with us today, who's an expert in Bond travel, traveling like Bond. But you get that real kind of glamour of the plane. And perhaps it's kind of a nostalgic thing as well. There's a retro appeal to it, looking at it now, because it's always so much nicer than any experience of going through an airport is today. But even in the more modern Bond films, when you do see him traveling, for me, it doesn't have that same kind of level of glamour. I'm thinking of the Quantum of Solace plane scene, which has always irked me.
In fact, funny enough, I just saw it pop up. I know Anthony's keeping an eye on the chat, and we'll go through what's in there later, but I couldn't help but see Christian's just mentioned that Quantum of Solace scene. I do actually I know you're not as big a fan of it as I am, but I do quite like that scene because it's melancholy and tragic. And he's downing 6 martinis, which, as far as I'm concerned, is actually an impossibility, at least the martinis that Bond orders. At least without a massive hangover. I mean, James Bond does get hangovers in the novels, quite a lot of them, but doesn't get them in the films. He also doesn't seem to get jet lag at all.
Right.
So anyway, you know, James Bond's superhuman, as we know, at least in the films. And but that scene, it's funny we've talked about Quantum of Solace's scene, because when I first saw that film in the cinema in 2008, I was completely lost in that scene. I mean, I know there's issues around the editing of Quantum of Solace, which lots of people like to bang on about, but it was interesting. We didn't have an exterior shot of the plane. We just cut straight to James Bond, and it's this massive first class, you know, upper deck, I think it is. But because there's no establishing shot, you have no idea what's going on. At least if you've, you know, I've never traveled in that kind of style on an aeroplane before. Some people might have. So, but yeah, it's almost like they've kind of truncated those traveling scenes. And I know that Quantum of Solace, they put those fancy titles up to kind of represent the different locations, which I think they needed to kind of make it coherent. But yeah, I'm kind of do pine for more protracted traveling scenes in a Bond story.
And I think for me as well, that scene, I do really like the kind of melancholy aspect of it, and that we do have that reflectiveness that comes through when he's in transit, but he's with a group of people. So that always struck me as strange, because usually we see him either traveling alone or with one other ally that he's picked up on the way, whether it's Felix Leiter or whether it's the main female character from the story. And somehow, to me, them all being on the plane together, it has like Famous Five vibes. It's like, it feels too chummy, you know, and too comfortable, too easy somehow. I don't feel the sort of level of stakes coming through.
Yeah, I get that. And Fleming himself actually says in Goldfinger, I found as I was re-skimming through today, Bond didn't mind airports so long as he was alone in them.
There you go. See?
So he really does like the solo feel, you know, meandering in that. He meanders around, he has a drink, he buys a couple of books from the bookshop, the souvenir shop. He tries to get like a little gimmick for his secretary, that kind of stuff. Yeah,
that's right. And Phil's just mentioned it's product placement in the movies. That's a really good point. And it's interesting, that moment in that you were just describing, David, in the books.
Version, isn't it?
The kind of product placement, as it were, there is the books that he's reading. He gets a book on golf and Raymond Chandler. And I always really love that touch, because Raymond Chandler admired Ian Fleming's prose and vice versa. And those are two writers who I think are, you know, two of the most important writers in the 20th century, but often are kind of overlooked critically. So it's nice that they sort of had that appreciation for each other, and that Fleming gives him a bit of a nod in that moment.
You almost get the feeling that he's not actually a big fan of flying, Bond. And I know we're going to talk a little bit more about fear of flying, but one thing he does definitely love is trains.
Yes.
And you can't, there are such great train sequences in Bond. I know Anthony's just flagged that up in the chat as well. But he, you know, whether it's a plane, whether it's a train, these are spaces, and I use this word a lot, and I know you use this word a lot. Those are very liminal spaces. So places of transition where you're kind of not one thing or another, you're not one place or another. So have you got any thoughts on the liminality of Bond in relation to travel?
I think that's another reason why travel is so central in Bond's world, because liminality and transience are really central to Bond's character. In Moonraker, he says that he feels alien in England, which is really interesting for a character that we consider such an icon of Britishness. But he doesn't feel at home here, and he doesn't really feel, I think, at home anywhere. He's himself when he's moving, and so he's inherently unsettled. And that's, I think, why we see him moving through so many kind of in-between spaces, like airports, railway stations, on trains, on planes. He's always going. He's a character who I think has to move. He's defined by his movement. And it's interesting that one of the most important moments in his life takes place in an airport. He proposes to Tracy in the airport on Her Majesty's Secret Service. And, you know, marriage is this idea of permanence and being settled and being rooted. And yet he proposes to somebody in an airport, the most kind of liminal space that you could be in. I find that contradiction really interesting with his character.
I do find it weird in the novel of On Her Majesty's Secret Service as well, that he just kind of dumps her in the airport.
Yeah.
and she has to make her own way home. I'm just like,
Yeah.
why doesn't she just get on the plane with Bond? I mean,
Yeah.
there might be a reason I've forgotten, but last time I read it a few months ago, I was like, this makes no sense.
Yeah. It's because I think he has to carry on with his mission. So he's like, okay, let's get married. I'll see you at the end. I promise not to die. And then she takes off his like really raggedy scarf to mend. It's not the most romantic scene in the world. But
She
there is
has
that
such a
lovely moment.
dangerous escape as well. Like
Yeah.
he's just on a plane and she's got to evade all these enemies. And I'm like, what are
Yeah.
you doing, James?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, Anthony, you're right. The stable is much more romantic in that.
Yeah, that was an improvement from the film, I'll be honest. So many Bond locations though, you know, airports, you know, even like countries and boundaries are really permeable with Bond as well, aren't they? So some of my favorite Bond stories in film as well as in literature take place in those sorts of places. So the Living Daylight short story, which is transposed from Berlin in the book to, I want to say, Bratislava in the film. But those are very much places which have, you know, they've changed governments. Literally, with Berlin, you've got a dividing wall. So so many locations are liminal, aren't they?
Yeah, absolutely. And often we have in the films, whether it's like Die Another Day going into North Korea, and then the kind of DMZ, or whether it's Tomorrow Never Dies with the territorial waters and the question of, you know, who do the waters belong to and where are they? There's often a sense of not necessarily being lost, but maybe trespassing into no man's land, or having to pass through an area that nobody has claimed and is therefore lawless. There's something almost Western about it, this idea of being in frontiers or being in lawless spaces.
Yeah. Didn't you actually have to, if you don't mind sharing this, didn't you actually kind of make an adjustment to Double or Nothing as you were writing it because of something in No Time to Die? And I'm thinking about the location of one of those places, because if I'm remembering correctly, I know it was shot on the Faroe Islands, which I really want to visit. Someone's actually put a gravestone there to kind of say James Bond was blown up here. And that's a spoiler for No Time to Die, but I know everyone here will absolutely have been there, done that, bought the t-shirt.
That would be so funny if one of you looked hugely shocked.
I know, James Bond died? What? So, but also, it's sort of a similar situation, isn't it? It's supposed to be contested Japanese territory in Skyfall as well. So it's kind of Russia and Japan, and no one really knows who the island belongs to.
Yeah, there's all these really interesting islands between Japan and Russia and the Sea of Okhotsk, which I'm probably butchering the pronunciation, I'm sorry. But they're islands that kind of passed between the USSR and Japan. And some of them were used as gulags and prison islands by Russia. And they're kind of contested now. And I wanted to end the book there. So at the end of Double or Nothing, my original idea was that they'd get off the yacht and be on one of these islands. And the Flemings were like, yeah, you can't really do that, but we can't tell you why. There were a few things like that where they said, you can't do that, but we can't tell you why. And then I watched No Time to Die and was like, oh, that's why. That's annoying.
That's annoying, isn't it?
Yeah.
But it's interesting, they've used that similar setup several times in quite recent times in the series. It's like you can't really, and I know it's kind of the tradition of the Bond series not to be political in the sense of showing you know, even the Russians are rarely villains, even in Fleming's novels, increasingly as they go on. You know, that's why he creates Spectre and all of that, but he doesn't want to kind of tie Bond down to being within places that, you know, have national boundaries. So it's kind of places which are really flexible and changing hands quite a lot.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that it's really interesting, the idea of, is James Bond political? I think all stories are inherently political, because even to say something isn't political is itself a political statement. But certainly I think there was an effort on Fleming's part and the film's part towards the end of the Cold War to try and make Russia kind of less the enemy, and to bring in instead, you know, mad industrialists or terrorist groups or you know, people who weren't affiliated. And maybe that does actually transpose onto the travel, that he goes to these places that are kind of unaffiliated or contested spaces. And he has his kind of rituals as he moves through these places, you know, both places that we can go to and the kind of very forbidden zones.
It's interesting you say about rituals, because I think we should talk now about Bond's travel tips. We've collated a list of about 12 travel tips here, haven't we? So if you want to travel like James Bond, and as we said at the top of the show, you might not always want to follow this advice. I think starting with the first one as one, Bond actually doesn't have and I'm very aware, I think we have Edward Biddulph in the audience tonight, who's the expert on Bond food, and he would definitely corroborate this. Bond doesn't know what he's talking about when he's ordering food, does he? Let's be honest.
That's right. And he actually says in one of the books, he thinks to himself, I'm not a gourmet, I don't know anything about food. And this leads to, crisis every time he's abroad and he's trying to work out where to have dinner. But his one rule is he hates tourist traps. And there's actually, on Her Majesty's Secret Service, there's 3 pages of just Bond moaning about going to these tourist traps with cowbells and stuff. So, we think of Bond as this very rattling, actiony pace, but he takes 3 pages out just to complain about touristy restaurants.
So if you ever find yourself in a foreign country going, or on TripAdvisor trying to find somewhere nice to eat, that's a very Bondian thing, because he really does. I mean, he doesn't show this weakness necessarily, as much as we might, kind of asking locals for advice, but he's pretty clueless when it comes to food.
He is, and his advice is to always eat in a railway station, hotel, restaurant, and sometimes stay there as well. And he has this whole kind of logic around how they have to be good because a lot of people rely on them because they're traveling through, and so it'll be kind of reliable fare.
That's
personally, I don't think that stands up today. I wouldn't follow that rule.
No, definitely not. I mean, every time I've stayed in a hotel near a railway station, I have regretted it. I'm sure there might have been some differences in the 1950s and 60s, but yeah, I wouldn't take that travel advice. Definitely not. I suppose the one thing, I think we talked about this in our last show together, the kind of ritual of going into a hotel room and checking it for listening devices. I mean, I do that. Who'd want to listen to me? But if there's, I always take some grapes with me and squish them into the microphones. No, not really. Put hairs over the cracks and all that. But I can't lie. Whenever I enter a hotel room, I do kind of picture that scene from Russia with Love, which is a 3-minute sequence or something with the Bond theme playing just as he walks around the hotel room.
Yeah. And I think I love those scenes so much. And I think partly because they're in the films, they're just testament to how watchable Sean Connery is. We're just happy to watch him do that. But in the books as well, we see Bond's attention to detail, and he talks in Casino Royale when he's having dinner with Vesper. He talks about how he's quite kind of fussy when it comes to food and drink within his limited knowledge, it would seem. And he's fussy about details, and he talks about how partly it's a matter of being a bachelor, and so there's nobody else to take care of the details for him, which is an interesting reflection of the gender politics of the 1950s. But he also says that he has to take care of details because it will save his life. And I really like those moments where we see his professionalism in hotel rooms. So that's a rule. Always check your hotel room for listening devices.
I think one of the things that's really appealing about Bond is his decisiveness, even if his decisions are appalling, like ordering the breakfast in From Russia with Love. Now, every time I see figs in Morrison's, I buy them to feel like James Bond. But I'll be honest, yogurt, figs, and cinnamon, or I love black coffee. It's just this is not the best breakfast, James.
Yeah, but that is a rule of his. Wherever you are in the world, order the local breakfast. He's famous for his scrambled eggs, isn't he? But when he's traveling, he has the local breakfast. And we always have these moments of him packing, and every time, no matter whether he's packing undercover or packing as himself, it's a battered suitcase. Always a battered suitcase. So if you don't have a battered suitcase, just throw one under a car and stamp up and down on it, and then you'll be traveling like James Bond.
So no expensive luggage for James Bond. I know there is expensive 007 branded luggage, which I'm very envious of, and because I could never afford it, I don't think. But yeah, I'll just console myself with my battered suitcase. Yeah.
And then his packing. So obviously he goes to all sorts of different places, but I think the outfit that comes up most often in his packing is dark blue tropical worsted trousers, a Sea Island cotton shirt, socks, and black casual shoes. And when Fleming lists this, he then puts in brackets, Bond thought, he says something like, Bond found shoelaces abhorrent, which is a really quite extreme feeling about shoelaces. So no shoelaces, that's another rule in your packing.
I'm sure there's a name for the fear of shoelaces. Someone can look it up for us.
Yeah, anybody here speak Latin, come up with it for us. And don't make your clothes identifiable. And so no tags, nothing can be traced to you. Don't lose your suitcase, because obviously the exploding gas canister could kill somebody.
And if you've not labeled any of your clothes, no one's ever going to know whose suitcase it is. Yeah.
Yes, that's true. It can't be returned to you.
Properly.
Yeah. And then we have, let's see, take clothes for all conditions, or know an extremely fast working tailor. So in Live and Let Die, he gets kitted out like an American very, very quickly.
The film, isn't it? I love that moment where he says, I'll keep those two. That one's a little frantic. Yeah, he doesn't want a very lively pattern tie.
Yeah. And of course, when you enter your hotel room, immediately take an ice cold shower.
Yeah.
Don't bother with museums. Fleming doesn't in Thrilling City.
I mean, if you've read Thrilling Cities, I don't think Fleming would actually use the sights to see section of any travel guide, to be honest, because he always just seems to, well, he just sort of, he goes to the kind of bars and restaurants and, you know, all those sorts of places. But then there's some really odd chapters in Thrilling Cities, like when he goes to Chicago. And when I first read this, I was like, oh, I love Chicago. I'd love to find out what Fleming thought about Chicago. He spends the whole time trailing the police around, learning about organized crime. I'm like, you know, whatever floats your boat, Ian. While you're in Chicago, there's some lovely sights to see while you're here, but yeah, he doesn't do museums, does he?
No, it's the same when he goes to Macau. He meets with a gang leader. Basically, he meets with like sort of the head of the Macau mob, who gives him lunch and fills him in on organized crime, which I used a bit of in Double or Nothing.
Yeah. But that was it. I know we're kind of tangenting here, but before the last couple of these, but you wrote Double or Nothing in the UK without having visited some of those places. You know, you couldn't actually visit some of the places. The novel opens in Syria. So did you feel like when I was doing my writing about James Bond, which I started at the start of COVID, I can't help but think that I was using it as some kind of escape because I couldn't go anywhere. Did you feel the same when you were writing Double or Nothing?
Absolutely. It was a really surreal experience in a way to be writing this story, which is inherently globe trotting. And we've talked a little bit about the kind of the sort of quest structure of Bond. But if you think of Bond like almost like a sort of ancient myth, he receives his mission from M. He leaves home, he goes on a journey, he picks up a couple of allies, he encounters the monster, and then in Bond's case, usually goes undercover with the monster, is discovered, tortured, wins the day, and then gets the prize, which is usually the woman. And that structure is inherently, like we were saying earlier, it's about movement, it's about going. And I was writing it through all 3 lockdowns, so I couldn't go anywhere. I was, you know, very much just in the one room. But I found this was a really kind of life-saving escape, because it allowed me to imagine into other spaces and imagine myself making those journeys. And so it did really save me. So I did a mixture of, I wrote about places I'd already been, and then I wrote about places I knew people who had been there, so I could talk to them about it. But then, of course, there are some places that, you know, pandemic or otherwise, I couldn't go because it's, you know, a war zone or not safe, if for some other reason. So there's also that kind of vicarious travel experience that Bond gives us, where we can experience going to places we otherwise never would, through reading Bond or watching Bond. Brilliant.
And I suppose just to finish off our list of Bond's travel tips, I mean, we've already talked about take the sleeper train if it's an option, which I know always sleeper trains in the UK, and I've done them both, including the one to Edinburgh fairly recently. But I actually did one on my honeymoon as well. How do you find sleeper trains?
I love sleeper trains so much. The only issue I have with them is I get so excited I don't sleep.
Yeah.
So I'm just like in from Russia with love in my mind. and then I just spend the whole time like overexcited.
I suppose this leads on to the last one, because whenever you're on board a train, you've got magnificent views, and that's part of the reason why it's just so fantastic, you know, compared with looking out a plane window, which most of the time, unless you get very lucky and you happen to see the Northern Lights on the way back from Japan, which I did when I took that school trip a few months ago, but usually it's just like, oh, more clouds. But you do get a room with a view, I suppose. Now, this is probably the one that I disagree with most. with Fleming or Bond, or Fleming writing as Bond, because at the end of The Man with the Golden Gun, Bond is like, again, not settling down with Mary Goodnight, not settling down with the girl, and there's that devastatingly horrible line about settling down with any woman would be like taking a room with a view, and that view would always pall. And I always request a room with a view. You always put that on the booking, don't you? But
Yeah.
I'm trying to work out, why does James Bond never want a room with a view?
I think maybe it goes back to that idea of movement again, that if you have a room with a view, maybe his fear is you're satisfied with it. You're satisfied with the one view. Or snipers, that's a good point. But he always wants to be on the go, and he wants change. I think that's also why the idea of being in a relationship with one person is so unsettling to him, because there's that permanence to that, and I think he's kind of allergic to permanence as a character.
Great. Fear of commitment.
Yeah.
Yeah. We talked very briefly about our early childhood experiences of travel, and I know we've kind of been making up for lost time and going to lots of exciting locations as adults. But yeah, you did get to go to a couple of Bond locations, didn't you, when you were growing up?
Yeah. So I said we didn't travel much when I was young, which was true, apart from some like really extreme moments of travel. So we didn't kind of do little holidays, but I went to Japan when I was 10, which was pretty mind-blowing, to visit family there. And then when watching You Only Live Twice and reading it, that was so exciting, having been there. But the big one for me was going to Russia. My school, it was really amazing. My school organized a trip to Moscow and St. Petersburg for history A-level. Wow. And they made it subsidized. So students like me who, were like free school meal kids could go for very little. And it was phenomenal. And I was so excited to be, From Russia with Love is my favorite film, my favorite novel. And to be there at the kind of center of Cold War stories, whether or not they go to Russia or not. And nobody in my friend group really was a Bond fan. So I don't know if other people have had this experience where in your mind you're just like completely geeking out, but you can't voice it to anybody. But I just found that so thrilling cities, but also very moving to be in Moscow and St. Petersburg.
I think probably my most memorable childhood travel experience was I'm really grateful for this in retrospect, but my parents used to choose quite random places to go on holiday. So my dad took us to Czechoslovakia in 1991, I think. So it was still very Soviet. And we went there on a coach, so it took about 2 days to get there in those really itchy seats. But I didn't realize, of course, that it was a Bond location, because The Living Daylights wasn't on TV. I just checked this earlier, until 1992. So there's no way I could know I was in a James Bond location. In hindsight, it's really cool, but at the time I was like, my friends are going to Florida. Why are we going to Czechoslovakia? So I'm not being ungrateful if my parents ever watch this. It was great that we got to some of those kind of weird, very liminal places. But yeah, and in hindsight, I'm really grateful for it.
Yeah, and you and I have also done some very deliberate Bond kind of pilgrimages. Now that we're in charge of our own holidays. So for me, going to Venice is my number one Bond holiday, going there for the Biennale. And I went to the conservatoire where Roger Moore walks across, and where Daniel Craig does his shootout. And I did pretend to be Bond. An Italian man did tell me to stand up straight and walk properly. And I had to explain to him, I'm in the middle of a shootout. What do you think? What do you think I'm doing? And it was just, I felt giddy, like I was at Disneyland, being there and going to all the locations. It was, really amazing. And my sister was very patient going to all of them.
You mentioned that because one of the first places we could actually go to when lockdowns were easing, although for a 3-day trip we had to do 4 COVID tests. It was madness. We went to Gibraltar, and I knew what Anthony was thinking. He booked it for my, I think it was birthday present, and it was because of The Living Daylights. But I was just like, Oh God, finding these locations, I looked it up in advance. Finding these locations is going to be an absolute nightmare. So I was just like, don't worry, darling, we're not going to walk across the whole Rock of Gibraltar for the whole day, just trying to find where Timothy Dalton jumped off this ledge and whatever. So I was really gratified that we were just walking along one day. And I think I put it up on Instagram at the time, actually. We were just walking along one day, and you know that I just could just see this moment from the film. So I couldn't resist doing the whole jumping and scaring a couple of monkeys and all that. But people must look at you and go, who are these people?
Yeah, there's something wrong with that person.
Why is it you think that we like to do that?
I think so much of Bond is about fantasy. He's living this kind of impossible life, and we watch it vicariously and we imagine ourselves into that fantastical role. But then when you actually go to the real places, you know, we can't go to Ken Adams sets, we can't kind of go to the volcano lair and whatever. But when we go to the real places, it's like the fantasy becomes reality. And for a moment, you are in James Bond's world. And you know, for me anyway, that comes with a real thrill, because you're directly in touch with this thing that we all love so much.
We both said that we would kind of pick a favorite part of Fleming, which kind of spoke to us as travelers and experiences that we've had. I always bang on about You Only Live Twice. It's right there. It's in the License to Queer logo that Ruben Wakeman created for me, you know, because it's by far my favorite. And Japan is this probably is where I got my love of Japanese things from, but obviously from a kind of written from an outsider's point of view. And I just find the way that Fleming deals with this really, really intriguing. So I'm just gonna read the first couple of paragraphs from You Only Live Twice, and then I'm just gonna kind of say why it speaks to me. So the very opening chapter. The geisha, called Trembling Leaf, on her knees beside James Bond, leant forward from the waist and kissed him chastely on the right cheek. That's a cheat, said Bond severely. You agreed that if I won, it would be a real kiss on the mouth, at the very least, he added. Grey Pearl, the madam, who had black lacquered teeth, a bizarre affectation, and was so thickly made up that she looked like a character out of a no play, translated. There was much giggling and cries of encouragement. Trembling Leaf covered her face with her pretty hands, as if she were being required to perform some ultimate obscenity. Fleming likes that word, obscene, uses it a lot. But then the fingers divided and the pert brown eyes examined Bond's mouth, as if taking aim, and her body lanced forward. This time the kiss was full on the lips, and it lingered fractionally. In invitation? In promise? Bond remembered that he had been promised a pillow geisha. Technically, this would be a geisha of low caste. She would not be proficient in the traditional arts of her calling. She would not be able to tell humorous stories, sing, paint, or compose verses about her patron. But, unlike her cultured sisters, she might agree to perform more robust services. Discreetly, of course, in conditions of the utmost privacy and at a high price. But to the boorish, brutalized tastes of a Gaijin, a foreigner, this made more sense than having a tanker of 31 syllables, which in any case he couldn't understand, equate in exquisite ideograms his charms with budding chrysanthemums on the slopes of Mount Fuji. So I love that extract because it is almost like Fleming's dropping you right into Japan. Like, there's all this, and Fleming does that brilliantly, doesn't he? You know, in Thrilling Cities, he went to Tokyo and other places in Japan, so he really did his research. But he's still like, for a reader, especially in 1960, I'm going to get the year wrong, but 1964, for a reader in 1964, that would have been like being dropped into the middle of Japan itself. And for me, that's why I love Japan so much, because when you go there, you do, even now, you kind of feel it is so exotic and so different. And I think Fleming's really good at kind of making you feel as if you're there.
Yeah, absolutely. I remember that actually going to Japan when I was 10, so it was a long time ago, but I remember being really amazed by the number of things done by robots even there. You know, it felt like very much being in almost the future going there, you know, and that was back then. I love that passage. So I'm going to read just a couple of paragraphs from Russia with Love. This is Bond on a plane. And this is not only my favorite bit of kind of travel writing in the novels, but possibly some of my favorite writing altogether in Fleming. So I'll just read you a couple of paragraphs. The plane is in turbulence and Bond doesn't really like flying. So here we are. Bond smelt the smell of danger. It is a real smell, something like the mixture of sweat and electricity you get in an amusement arcade. Again, the lightning flung its hands across the windows. Crash! It felt as if they were the center of the thunderclap. Suddenly, the plane seemed incredibly small and frail. 13 passengers, Friday the 13th. Bond thought of Lola Ponsonby's words, and his hands on the arms of his chair felt wet. How old is this plane, he wondered. How many flying hours has it done? Had the death watch beetle of metal fatigue got into the wings? How much of their strength had it eaten away? Perhaps he wouldn't get to Istanbul after all. Perhaps a plummeting crash into the Gulf of Corinth was going to be the destiny he had been scanning philosophically only an hour before. In the center of Bond was a hurricane room, the kind of citadel found in old-fashioned houses in the tropics. These rooms are small, strongly built cells in the heart of the house, in the middle of the ground floor, and sometimes dug down into its foundations. To this cell, the owner and his family retire if the storm threatens to destroy the house, and they stay there until the danger is past. Bond went to his hurricane room only when the situation was beyond his control and no other possible action could be taken. Now he retired to this citadel, closed his mind to the hell of noise and violent movement, and focused on a single stitch in the back of the seat in front of him, waiting with slackened nerves for whatever fate had decided for BEA flight number 130. And you'll have to read the book to find out if he lives or dies in From Russia with Love.
Although joking aside, perhaps a minor spoiler if you haven't read your Double or Nothing, you use the concept of the hurricane room, don't you, in that?
Yeah, so I use that. Bond passes it on to Bashir as a bit of training, this idea of building a kind of mental hurricane room to retreat to when there's no other option. I really love that writing, and I love that use of something very concrete from the real world as an image for Bond's inner life. But again, it's something not from Scotland, from the tropics, from this place where he feels much more at home. And it's also interesting that he uses the death watch beetle of fatigue as a way to describe what could have happened to the metal of the plane when he's worried it's falling apart. Because in the opening of Goldfinger, when he's sitting in the airport, he talks about the death watch beetle of the soul eroding him from killing so many people. So it's interesting that Fleming uses that phrase twice there in moments about travel, one about a fatigued plane, one about a fatigued soul. And I think that takes us back to what we were saying at the top about Bond being inherently about travel, about movement. It's like he's linking himself to the plane there, to this very imperiled plane. So yeah, I really love that writing.
And it's not just that novel where he actually demonstrates a fear of flying as well. It's in Live and Let Die and Diamonds Are Forever, isn't it? So and strangely, it's going back to what you said earlier. It's in chapter 6 of both Live and Let Die and Diamonds Are Forever. So there's that kind of classic overcoming the monster structure. It's like, at this point in the story, James Bond is going to travel somewhere.
Yes, now we're on our way.
Now we're on our way. There's so much more we could talk about with James Bond and travel, but I know that we said we'd leave lots of time for questions. So I suppose perhaps to lead into that, what are the kind of places that you'd really want to go to that you haven't gone to, or places that actually might be a little bit difficult because as a gay man and as a woman, there are parts of the world in particular where we would find difficult to travel, including quite a few James Bond locations. So what are the places that you would want to go to but you couldn't, and the places that you really set your sights on?
Good questions. While we answer these, folks, think of your questions and feel free to put them in the chat or raise your virtual hand. For me, I would love to go to Istanbul. I've never been there. And that would be kind of really top of the list. And then places that, might be kind of slightly trickier perhaps to travel to, but are kind of key Bond locations. Some very, war zones like Afghanistan, of course, currently. But I'd also love to go to Egypt. I've never been there, but, some bits are a bit trickier than others. But that sequence in The Spy Who Loved Me is one of my favorite sequences. So I'd love to go and see if I could repeat that. How about you?
I think, to be honest, I think Istanbul's top of my list of places that I'd really, really want to go to. And it's conceivable. I bought the travel guide, which I always think is a kind of, you've taken that step. So I've got that ready for when we do book a trip. But the one that, and I feel really ambivalent about, I really want to go, but I know that outside of resorts and things, it might be a bit difficult. I really want to go to Jamaica, and it's really, what could you get a more Bondian? Certainly, could you get a more Fleming location than that? But it's not just the whole homosexuality being illegal there because the Brits put it there 150 years ago. I think, but at some point, and hopefully things improve in the future, I'd really, really like to go there.
Yeah, I really agree. And it's interesting, that thing of the kind of layers of colonialism. When Bond travels, he travels often with an immense amount of privilege because he arrives into a colonized country where the police are on his side. And then we've left behind laws like homophobic laws, which make it difficult to travel now. So we get these kind of layers of history coming through with Bond. Looking at the chat, we've got some fantastic questions and points. A couple of really good points about, air travel not being considered both so kind of exotic nowadays, but also being linked to the climate crisis as well as other things. So not having that kind of allure. And really good point that you often see him more on a train. And we've got some nice questions coming through here. I'm just scrolling.
Oh, Tom Mason's highlighted. I use that line a lot, actually. Those lines we use in everyday life from James Bond. So this was about half an hour ago. In Living Daylights, I know a great restaurant in Karachi. We can just make dinner. I'd love that. I'd love to have that insider knowledge of any city I go to, but it really isn't there unless I've missed it. It really isn't there in the books, that kind of know it all about where.
He is quite a know-it-all. Often, whether it's like foreign currencies or the workings of Sotheby's. Tom, you have a question. Over to you. Feel free to unmute yourself.
Yeah, feel free.
So I just had some thoughts about how things that you mentioned, where obviously now we intrinsically link certain locations to certain Bond films, and also the books, but mainly with the films being so visual. I think that's, it's a big part of it, and pilgrimages and going there.
Yeah. And
of course, you and I will know this, David, from when we've talked about diamonds and On Her Majesty's Secret Service and things. It's interesting. I wonder if you had any ideas or thoughts about at what point you thought that thing that maybe became such a big thing, because of course in the 60s they adapted the Fleming books fairly literally or exactly, but then we come to something like Diamonds and we think Las Vegas, but as we know from reading the treatments, that was never intended to be in the film. It was going to be in the Far East. And then if you compare that to Man with the Golden Gun, they then used those locations there, but that book isn't set there. It's in a totally different part of the world. And that's just, I wonder at which point, maybe, of course, with the modern films, that's not so much an issue really when they're largely adapting or creating with new material, but at which point do you think maybe there was this sense that actually maybe the locations are a certain thing, almost a character of their own? I suppose in You Only Live Twice in Japan, maybe they are then, but with the 70s films, it seems a bit more elastic, I suppose, in the production.
I suppose that in a sense, the locations had to get more and more unattainable, didn't they? Because some of these places actually were within the reach of with people as the 70s and 80s progressed. And I think that goes back to what we were saying about, these contested islands, which you would never get clearance to go to, like the abandoned Japanese island that was used for Skyfall. It's really difficult to get. So what do you think, Kim?
Well, I think I think you're right that the location as character was always a really big part of the writing, particularly in, I think you're totally right, something like You Only Live Twice. But even in something like Diamonds Are Forever, where the locations in the book really structure the book, because it's about that smuggling pipeline. So you're kind of in each stage, and each place takes on its own character. And then, as you say, the films do become a bit more kind of elastic. And I don't know if anyone else is like this, but I enjoy looking up, like, where does it purport to be versus where is it actually filmed? And then you discover, like, oh, it's an airport in Kent, and it's all a bit less exciting. But But I think that probably there is that element, as you were saying, David, of wanting to go more and more into the unattainable, and that being harder and harder. So creating these locations that almost seem fantastical, or seem like they're almost like a fairy tale, going back to that kind of quest idea. And so it's departing more and more from kind of the world around us. And then there's also the idea of kind of making locations not idyllic, but suit the purpose of the filming. So going to Venice is funny because I don't know if anyone else has done it, but trying to see the film locations is really hard because the way they stitch Venice together in the film is really nothing like Venice in real life. So you turn a corner expecting to see a square and it's actually on the other side of Venice. And so there's also the sense of taking the real world and still making that unreal in how they film it.
One of my biggest, not disappointments necessarily, but realizations that this is not like the on-screen version was when we went for one of the very first Valentine's days Anthony and I had was in Paris. So I booked, and I didn't tell him this, but I booked the restaurant in the Eiffel Tower because of A View to a Kill. He probably worked because we love that film anyway. But you walk in and you go, this is not where there's for a start, there's no person waving a butterfly around. And then it's like, this is not what it looks like. So that is, sorry folks, if you ever do it, it is a set. But there's been a few like that. But funny you say that, Kim, about everyday places. The new Mission Impossible film, there's a big chunk of that that's supposed to be Abu Dhabi Airport, but it's actually the local railway station where we live. So there's scenes in that film which are like, we've been to that restaurant, and Tom Cruise and Hayley Atwell have this intense conversation, getting to know each other in Pho, a Vietnamese restaurant. But it's just like, we've sat there. So it is slightly surreal seeing those things.
Yeah, a bit less glamorous. We had a nice question from Edward. In your location visiting, were there any descriptions in the books that you discovered did not quite match reality? One of my favorite short stories is The Living Daylights, which we touched on earlier, set in Berlin. And that's interesting because so before his kind of rendezvous with the sniper, he has like a day to spend in Berlin. So he just kind of wanders around. And I love that story. And going to Berlin the first time, I went to Hotel Adlon and all these places that he describes, and he talks about thrilling cities as well. But of course, he's talking about it, with Checkpoint Charlie running through, with the buildings bombed, with bullet marks, with kind of, sad potted plants and green wallpaper in the hotel. And now it's, all spruced up, and the American embassy is there, and it's incredibly shiny. And the hotel is incredibly fancy. So that's a real kind of juxtaposition for me. And actually, again, I borrowed a bit of Thrilling Cities in Double or Nothing, when Harwood goes to Hotel Adlon and she thinks about M's memories of the hotel in the Cold War. That's actually Fleming from Thrilling Cities. So I was just, let's call it creative plagiarism. That's it.
Would you recommend Thrilling Cities to people who haven't read it, Kim? I think I know what the answer is already.
Yeah, very much so. Not only as a piece of travel writing, but also a historical artifact, looking into the Cold War, looking into the kind of remnants of Imperial Britain, and into Fleming's life as well. So very much recommend.
One of the things that jumped out to me when I read it the first time was like, Fleming was a fan of Disneyland. So not a lot of people know this. Well, he did say in the LA section, Disneyland and Marineland should be included in the Grand Tour. And at both places, there are good restaurants. Now, there are good restaurants at Disneyland, but again, I fear that Fleming may not have been having, anyway, you have to decide for yourself.
Vinny asks, which locations not featured in the books or movies would you like to see Bond visit? So this is fun for me because I actually get to make it happen. So you'll see it in book 2. But David, what about you? Where would you all like Bond to go?
Anthony and I talk about this quite a lot, actually, because we've got a big map above our computer downstairs of kind of places we want to go to. And there are some on places Bond hasn't been to. I'm like, well, they're lower down the priority list. But you know, places like New Zealand, and I think he goes to Australia in one of the Raymond Benson books, 0-10. That sort of, but it's, I don't know, is it not very Bondian because it's not very urban? I'm not sure.
That's interesting. A lot of my favorite Bond locations are very urban. I was thinking,
Yeah.
you know, whether it's Berlin, Venice, Paris, New York. I mean, Bond actually and Fleming, that's somewhere I'd like to see him go back to.
Yeah.
And let's see, got a few other good comments and questions coming in. Lots of nice points about the kind of in transit scenes, and the vicarious thrills that we get kind of watching it all happen.
Yeah. Oh yeah, Daniel points out that he knows all the hotel concierges around the globe.
Yes.
Your usual suite, Mr. Bond? I'm like,
yeah.
Huh?
I love that bit in Die Another Day.
It's in Living Daylights as well, isn't it? I'm like, how many times have you been to? Oh, Vienna, that's also on my list. See, we're going to think of all these places. I really want to go to Vienna. That's in Thrilling Cities as well.
Yeah, and we've got a few people naming locations they want to get to. His Gloria is one that I'd really love to go to as well. And Christian asked, do you have a favorite story of when you visited a Bond location? That's a really nice question. David, you got to go to a lot actually in Japan, didn't you?
Yeah, I did. I suppose it's not really a Bond location, but a sort of Bondian experience. We had a slightly traumatic visit to an onsen. So if you're not sure what an onsen is, it's a Japanese bathhouse. And this is the very first time that Anthony and I went to Japan about 12 years ago. So long story short, onsens, you walk around completely naked in an onsen, which is what Fleming describes in You Only Live Twice and also Thrilling Cities. And though Sean Connery wears a pair of naked coloured pants when he gets into the onsen in You Only Live Twice. But anyway, yeah, so an onsen is an interesting experience for a fairly prudish British person walking around open, shall we say, but the traumatizing element of going to the onsen actually recalled, not You Only Live Twice, but there's a scene in Diamonds Are Forever, the novel, where Bond gets put in hot mud and wrapped up. So we were placed in hot sand because it seemed like a good idea at the time, and wrapped up in these hot sand. And the funny thing is, after about 20 minutes, they were like, it's in this stifling room. We were wrapped in hot sand. It's supposed to be healthy. So we were wrapped in like we were basically mummies. And then after 20 minutes, someone comes in and says, do you want more sand? And both Anthony and I chorused, no, absolutely not. It was the worst experience I think I've ever had in my entire life. It was intensely claustrophobic, but it then recalled, and Anthony's reading Diamonds Forever at the moment. He was like, oh my God, this is exactly like that. We've still got PTSD about that experience in Japan. So it's very Bondian, but Bond has this kind of ambivalent attitude towards kind of like health treatments, doesn't he? He hates shrublands in Thunderball.
Yes.
He hates that in Diamonds Forever, but he likes a good massage. So it's like he doesn't mind being pampered in some ways, but definitely in others. I
think it depends who's doing the massaging when it comes to Bond.
Although strangely, he's actually a man in Casino Royale. I'll just point that out.
Yeah.
So Fleming,
and he always has the descriptions of the very flat bottoms, doesn't he? So I'll tell you quickly because I'm aware of the time. I've got some lovely comments coming in. Phil saying with Jamaica, you can feel Fleming with every step, and I'm campaigning for Phil to take me to Jamaica at some point. My favorite story of visiting a Bond location. Well, so in Venice, something strange happened. We went for the Biennale, the opening of the Biennale, and I'd never been before, and if you haven't been, I very much urge you to go. Every year Venice puts on an art show or an architecture show, and all of Venice becomes a gallery. So you're walking around, there's just art everywhere. It's extraordinary. And because of the Flemings, I was invited to go early for the kind of pre-show, which is a few days before it opens to everybody else. And we were given these VIP tickets. So it's very strange kind of living like a VIP for a few days. And there are people there who are kind of major art collectors, and, it's like lots of money kind of sloshing around. And we were invited to go for drinks with the president of the Biennale at the palace where the Biennale has their headquarters. So I didn't really know what to expect from this, But, you know, if the president invites you somewhere, you say yes. So I said yes. But we kind of thought this would be like a small, like, cocktail gathering. So we went along and went to this palace and got to the top floor. It was a stunning location. And then walked in, and there were all these state dignitaries there. So there were generals and admirals and really high up priests and major politicians. And we're kind of hesitating on the threshold, like, this can't be right, can it? You know, we really been invited here, and if so, why? And then the curator came and saw us and swept us in, and took us over to the president of the Biennale. And I said, oh, hello, you know, thank you very much for the invitation. And the president turned to me and said, ah, Mrs. Bond. I was like, I guess. I just didn't really know how to respond to that. And then he said, thank you so much for coming. I said, well, it's very nice of you to invite me. You know, what's the party for? And he said, oh, this is the party for state dignitaries. We thought you'd find it interesting. So we were just there with all these state dignitaries.
Wow. And
we ended up talking to this man who was very high up in the army, but he was an aide-de-camp to the general. And his job was to guard the general's hat, which the general had taken off. So he just had this hat and he couldn't really move. So we had a very interesting chat with him about, you know, security and national intelligence matters. He probably shouldn't have told me because he couldn't leave the hat. So I had him cornered. But altogether, it was a very surreal evening.
Amazing.
So thank you all so much for the lovely questions. And also people are sharing in the chat their favorite Bond locations and stories, which is really lovely.
I think Mark's pointed out that the early films tended to be just one major location, and I think that is a big shift as you go on. So there is a lot more globe hopping as you go.
Yes, yeah, I think that's really become part of it now, hasn't it? That almost every scene is in a different place, and perhaps that's also why we don't see him traveling so much. Because if we had a kind of 10-minute pack your bag sequence between each place, it would be kind of too much. So I think looking at the time, that draws us to a close. But thank you all so much for your comments in the chat, which are making me laugh, and for your lovely questions as well. David, do you have any thoughts to wrap us up?
I suppose a final question from me, quoting You Only Live Twice, and also Robert Louis Stevenson, is it better to travel hopefully than arrive?
That's a very good question. And that's such a nice Robert Louis Stevenson quote, and you folks will recognize it. Fleming breaks it in two and uses it to structure the book. And it's really interesting thinking about the role of travel in Robert Louis Stevenson's life, because Christopher's book, Boo, Stay Longer. Well, if you want my hour's lecture on Robert Louis Stevenson, buckle up. But he was in what was then known as an invalid. He had these hemorrhages. He suffered hugely with his lungs. And the kind of Victorian cure for this was to travel and to go to places that were considered to have better air. And so it's really interesting, the Victorian era, you have this paradox between people who are considered sort of invalid or invalid, if you look at the word like that way, kind of considered not almost part of the general sort of run-of-mill of life, like they're separated from it by their illness. And yet they're encouraged to go on these massive journeys, which are huge undertakings, which people who aren't considered ill don't take. So you've got this kind of interesting paradox there. And he would go on these massive journeys, and then suddenly, you know, his lungs would go into hemorrhage, he'd be coughing up blood, and he'd have to move into a hotel for a month. So I think probably for him, there was very much this sense of it's better to travel hopefully. You know, I go in hope of better health, or I go in hope of an adventure. You know, he was such a great travel writer as well. And whether or not he arrived, he didn't know if he would, because there was always the chance he would die on the journey. And then he settled abroad in Burma, I think, where the local indigenous community named him the King of Stories. And they would go to his house and demand that he came up with stories for them, which I love. So I like that ethos.
Any version of the Bond story where Bond is retired somewhere. So John Pearson biography, you've obviously got No Time to Die. It's not in England, is it?
No, that's right. And I think it's really interesting, this idea of, and you've written about this beautifully in your Skyfall piece, this idea of Bond as homeless. And in No Time to Die, we see him briefly settled, and you've all probably done this as well, but there's been a lot of people who've kind of paused on his house in Jamaica and kind of zoomed in to see like what's on his coffee table and what kind of crockery does he have, because it just seems so strange to us, this idea that Bond could have decorated and bought books and settled in, and obviously he can't stay there for long. Oh yeah, really good point. Christian saying the Moneypenny Diaries, you do have him retired to Scotland. Yeah. And it is fun driving through Glencoe and imagining that you could come across.
That's one I haven't done. I haven't done that.
Oh, it's when we went there, I was like so excited, and I had this whole plan that I was going to stand there like he does, you know, next to Judi Dench, and then we got out of the car and it was freezing cold. So I held up my proof copy of There Will or Nothing to the skies in offering, and then got back in the car very quickly. It's too cold.
I suppose actually I'd like to, and my last thing is to just kind of use another Robert Louis Stevenson quote. I know we're big fans of Robert Louis Stevenson, both of us. So a quote that I really like from him, apart from the traveling hopefully then to arrive, used by Fleming only twice. Robert Louis Stevenson said, bear in mind, as Kim's just said, this was someone who was, you know, had very serious illnesses throughout their entire life, but still, you know, had that get up and go. It says, I travel not to go anywhere, but to go. I travel for travel's sake. The great affair is to move.
Oh, I love that. Yeah, God, he's such a good writer. That's the main takeaway from today. Go and read more Robert Louis Stevenson if you haven't. And I think that takes us very nicely back to what we were saying about Bond being defined by movement, and that it's very hard to imagine him being still. When he is still, he's bored and he feels that kind of malaise, you know. So when we see him at the start of the stories in London without a mission, he has a real kind of melancholy on him. And it's movement, it's going that animates him and gives him his purpose in life. And Phil, our travel expert on the call, says, for me, the journey is the excitement. And I think that's exactly it, isn't it? Like, that's the exciting part. And the destination can be secondary, particularly if you're on a beautiful sleeper train or whatever it is. It's that feeling of adventure that takes us closer to feeling like James Bond.